Hello and welcome to the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra office. I'm Ashley Hall, host of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra podcast.
Happy holidays. I'm Greg Scholl, a trombonist in the Vancouver Symphony, and welcome to Da Capo.
I suppose the logical place to start today is jazz itself.
Yes, we could talk all day about jazz music, but it is worthwhile touching on it for our purposes today, since the concert is going to feature some jazz music and some jazz and pop influenced music from a pretty wide period of time. You know, jazz music really originated in the African American communities of New Orleans, Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
That is where it started. And it spread from there to places like St. Louis, New York City, Chicago, and eventually all the way to San Francisco on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm. I find it so interesting that it's such a distinctly American form of music.
That is absolutely right. And in fact, the two essentially American art forms that originated within the United States are jazz music and expressionist abstract painting, painting by people like Jackson Pollock and things like that. Jazz music didn't exist in Europe or other parts of the world, and neither did that style of painting.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be fair to say that jazz music didn't get influenced by cultures from other parts of the world, because that's what happened. It's a mix of European music with blues music and folk music, including music that was brought over from Africa.
Mm-hmm.
People that came here from Africa started playing music on different types of instruments than they were used to in Africa, and that all helped create the distinctive sounds of early jazz.
Mm-hmm. Like any artistic movement, jazz has gone through various periods.
For sure, and people that listen to a lot of jazz music can develop an ear where they start to really have the ability to detect regional textures and sounds. Within jazz music. People will say, oh, that's a very West Coast jazz, or that's very East Coast, and there's a lot of gradations in there. But in a broader context, the different eras of jazz have different period names, just like classical music, although it is in a shorter time frame. So early jazz led to swing band music or swing. We had big band music in the earlier part of the 20th century. That led to bebop, which led to hard bop, which led to cool. Then we have acid jazz, avant-garde, modern jazz, Latin jazz, free jazz. There's a lot of different kinds of jazz to choose from. The pieces that we'll hear on the concert today are mostly influenced by straight-ahead jazz or swing band music.
Mm-hmm. No conversation about jazz would be possible without Benny Goodman.
Benny Goodman is really the leader of one of the most popular musical acts and musical eras in U.S. history. He played during the big band era and during the swing era. This is the mid-1930s. But he had a huge impact that lasted for decades and decades. He gave a concert in Carnegie Hall, which some people say is the single most important jazz or popular music concert in the history of the United States. This was kind of the coming out party for jazz into the world of so-called respectable music.
Our guest, Kim Paklowski, has performed in a concert that was sort of a restaging of that original Benny Goodman concert.
That is amazing, and what a great endeavor to embark upon, to sort of look at that as the important concert it was and try to reiterate it so people can get a feel for what that was like. Goodman started, playing swing band music, and he did that not just in a big band setting that we're sort of familiar with, but he played swing music in a quartet and a sextet, and these bands that he played in worked a lot. But by the late 1940s, swing was starting to go into decline a little bit because of bebop, this new kind of jazz that had people playing very fast tempos and playing, showing virtuoso ability on their instruments in terms of how fast they could play and what they could do. And to his credit, Goodman tried to get into this kind of music, but in the end, he went back to swing, and he said maybe bebop has done more to set music back for years than anything. Basically, it is all wrong.
Oh, I'm sure Some people were not very happy with him for saying that.
That's right, and he was considered to be a very sort of intense person, and that judgment, if you know a little bit more about his personality, is sort of part of his overall approach to music, so we won't hold it against him too hard.
Right, and of course, he's really noteworthy for having an racially integrated musical group very early in American history.
During this era of our history when racial segregation was in full play, Benny Goodman had one of the first integrated musical groups and one of the first integrated jazz groups. He, in fact, helped sort of usher along racial integration in the United States. In the 1930s, black and white musicians could not play together in most clubs or in most concert venues. And in the southern states, racial segregation was being enforced by Jim Crow laws. Mm-hmm. Goodman hired African American musicians like Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton and a guitarist named Charlie Christian, and that not only helped them get their starts, but it showed that he was very equal rights minded and was willing to engage these musicians based on their skill. Now, this happened 10 years before Jackie Robinson broke into Major League Baseball's sort of 6-decade-long color line. And the reason that Goodman was able to do this, or one reason that he was able to do this, is because he was so popular. His popularity was such that he could remain financially viable without touring in the South if he didn't want to, where he could have been subject to arrest for violating Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, it's just so remarkable what he was able to do for American race relations, American musical culture, just such an important, crucial figure.
For sure, and he really cut across musical lines and boundaries as well. We think of him as this famous jazz musician. Often his efforts to play classical music and to engage with that type of music are overlooked. Mm-hmm. You know, in 1949, he started studying with a clarinetist named Reginald Kell.
Right.
And this required him to change his technique. Instead of using the mouthpiece a certain way, he adjusted his embouchure. He used new fingering techniques to become a better clarinet player. And in fact, he had his old finger calluses removed so that he could start to learn how to play the clarinet again from scratch.
Extreme measures.
I don't know how it was done, but that's what he did.
Oh, yeah, I don't like to imagine it.
He commissioned works for clarinet and various chamber ensembles that have become standard pieces of the classical repertoire. He performed clarinet concertos by people like Bela Bartok, Malcolm Arnold, Francis Poulenc, a neoclassical composer, and even Aaron Copland. Mm-hmm. This piece by Leonard Bernstein, which is called Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs, which is kind of a jazz-influenced piece that features a clarinet solo from the beginning of the piece. This was commissioned by Woody Herman's big band, but the piece was later premiered by Benny Goodman. Mm-hmm. And he also recorded Igor Stravinsky's Ebony Concerto. Benny Goodman also made some recordings of the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, as well as the Mozart Clarinet Concerto, and he recorded those with the Boston Symphony, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's a couple other things to mention about him. One in particular is that he was seen as a very strong disciplinarian within his band. He was regarded by some as a very demanding sort of taskmaster. Other people thought of him as this arrogant and even eccentric kind of martinet, kind of a military type approach to the band. And he was famous for this thing called the ray, which the musicians in his band would experience if they played something that he didn't like or played a mistake. He didn't talk to them, he just glared at them a certain way. And if you were the recipient of the ray, you might find yourself soon sitting in another chair or sitting in a less featured part of the band. The other thing that's worth mentioning about Benny Goodman, although he was a taskmaster within his band, he was a very generous person, and he funded several college educations for less fortunate players and other persons, but he always kept that secret. And when someone asked him, why do you keep it secret? You know, you engage in these very nice, generous activities. And he said, well, if they knew about it, everybody would come to me with their hand out.
A man of many facets,
That's
for sure.
true. That's true. And I think those will show through in the work of our soloist today.
Well, speaking of our soloist, I have to confess, I don't know very much about clarinets.
The clarinet is something that we're all used to hearing in the classical context, but it is, at least in some regards, a kind of a mysterious instrument. Reeded instruments are a little more complicated, at least to my mind. The clarinet works with a single reed. It's a single reeded instrument, and the way that it functions is the clarinet is basically an instrument that produces a vibrating column of air, and those vibrations are caused by this thin reed that the clarinetist will sand or file down till it's very thin. This is bolted onto the mouthpiece of the clarinet by a ligature, this round metal object that you sort of screw on. And when they blow across that reed into this tube, that reed starts to vibrate ever so slightly and very quickly against the rest of the mouthpiece. It's really the same principle as if when you were a kid you held a blade of grass between your hands and blew on it to make a honking noise. This is how a clarinet reed works. And so that vibration sets up this column of air. And then there's holes in the side of the clarinet, and the vibration, the column of air vibrates until it reaches a hole that's open. And then the air pressure is able to escape. So you get the vibration going by blowing across the reed, and then the pitch is determined by which holes you open along the body of the clarinet. And that makes the pitch go up and down because that air column is shrinking or lengthening. And there are a lot of them. There's actually, I think, about 12 different kinds of clarinets. We're used to seeing regular A or B flat clarinets in the orchestra. Sometimes they play a small E flat clarinet. The bass clarinet is the other one we see pretty often. It has kind of a gooseneck shaped neck on it and is bigger. It usually sits on the floor. But there's many other clarinets that are not often featured. The triple B flat octo contrabass clarinet, for example. There's one other thing worth mentioning, which is many celebrities seem to have some experience playing the clarinet.
Right.
Woody Allen, Jimmy Kimmel, Julia Roberts, Steven Spielberg, Alan Greenspan are all pretty accomplished clarinet players, but they're not as good as our very own Dr. Igor Shachman, who is the executive director of the Vancouver Symphony.
I'll make sure he knows you said that. Another composer featured in this concert who has shaped the American 20th century maybe in the greatest way possible would be Irving Berlin.
That's right. Irving Berlin is another one of these famous American composers. He really made his mark writing popular songs, although he did a lot of other types of musical work. You know, he immigrated here from Russia when he was 5 years old. And as a very young person, I think 13 years old, got a union card and started working as a musician. He was a composer, he was a songwriter, and he worked in Tin Pan Alley, which was a neighborhood of sorts in New York City, where music publishing and music writing, music scoring really was the occupation or the focus of the people who lived and worked there. Well, Irving Berlin wrote literally hundreds of songs, and they were popular songs, and they were often very topical. They had to do with things that were happening in the news or world developments or whatever the latest fad or craze was. So after a Hawaiian dance craze began, he wrote a song called That Hula Hula. He wrote a string of Southern songs with names like When the Midnight Choo-Choo Leaves for Alabama. And he wrote a song called Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning. These were things that people could identify with right away. And Alexander's Ragtime Band was one of those. This helped usher in this ragtime craze, not just in the United States, but abroad. Apparently people in Russia were crazy for ragtime music.
And the song itself is really quite funny, too, which helps a lot.
Of course, and on top of that, these songs ushered in new dances. The foxtrot, the chicken walk, the grizzly bear, all these dances started to emerge to go along with these popular songs.
What a time.
Yeah, it was quite an interesting period of time, and I think people were riveted on to not just hearing recordings of this music later, but at the time it was written, people would subscribe to the sheet music. Like you would have the sheet music delivered to your house the way now we might hear some music from some other media. It was a big deal to have the latest songs delivered, and traveling salesmen would go around with their suitcase full of new songs and try to convince you to buy that. As his career grew, he wrote some Broadway shows.
Right.
Annie, Get Your Gun is a good example of those. Some of these shows became feature films, like White Christmas. That's one of his most popular compositions.
Coming up on my annual watch of that.
That's right. It's right around the corner. A lot of jazz musicians like to take Broadway show tunes and turn them into what we call jazz standards, because the melodies are so good and the chords are so interesting. So instead of playing the blues or rhythm changes, which are very valid and everything else, jazz players like to sink their teeth into a different melody or a different chord progression, and that's how a lot of these Broadway show tunes become standards. Berlin's music has been performed by people like Frank Sinatra all the way up to Leonard Cohen and many other contemporary musicians.
Someone else who definitely seems to come up at every holiday season would be Leroy Anderson.
Yes, Leroy Anderson, who was alive up until 1975, was an American composer of very short, light concert pieces, of which many were introduced by the Boston Pops Orchestra under the direction of Anderson's friend Arthur Fiedler. John Williams described Anderson as one of the great American masters of light orchestral music, and that's what he was.
Definitely. I can't say I can recall a Christmas time that I didn't hear Sleigh Ride.
I can't recall a Christmas time that I didn't play Sleigh Ride, starting from the 7th grade. This will be the first year I think I haven't played it.
Oh, wow.
Anderson was trained at the New England Conservatory of Music, not unlike some of the players in the Vancouver Symphony. But the interesting thing about his education is he went on to Harvard University, and while he was at Harvard, he studied harmony and counterpoint and musical orchestration and the double bass. But he also received a PhD in German and Scandinavian languages. In fact, he spoke English and Swedish both during his youth and eventually became fluent in Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, German, French, Italian, and Portuguese.
Wow. So he probably didn't have a lot of spare time.
No, it sounds like he could communicate with just about anybody. He enlisted in the Army in 1942 and was assigned to Iceland with the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps as a translator and an interpreter. And this is something else you don't often say about a musical conductor or composer. In 1945, he was reassigned to the Pentagon as chief of the Scandinavian Desk of Military Intelligence.
Wow.
His duties did not prevent him from composing, and in 1945 he wrote the Syncopated Clock, which is one of his most famous compositions. Sleigh Ride, incidentally, was not written as a Christmas piece, but just as a work that describes a winter event, riding in a sleigh.
Right.
Anderson actually started writing that piece during a heat wave in August of 1946. And the Boston Pops recording of it was the first pure orchestral piece to reach #1 on the Billboard pop music chart.
Wow, that's really remarkable.
It was a big hit for him and the Boston Pops as well.
Something that I'm really excited for in this concert is going to be Vince Guaraldi's Christmas Time Is Here. I feel like there's probably not a single musical artist that is more indelibly connected to a particular entertainment icon than Giraldi and Peanuts.
That's absolutely right. It's a very powerful connection. Vince Guaraldi was an American jazz pianist. He was noted for innovative compositions and arrangements and for composing music for animated television adaptations of the Peanuts comic strip. And this included their signature melody, which we're all familiar with. Da, 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 da. That's called Linus and Lucy, and he wrote it. As well as Christmas Time Is Here, the holiday standard that the symphony will be playing today. Guaraldi wrote a lot of different kinds of music, of course, and it was a record that he put out in 1962 that made him somewhat famous. He included jazz impressions of Black Orpheus, which is a famous film. It's worth a look, in my opinion. It's a French/Brazilian film. And he wrote some music related to that movie. It was released as a single, the Samba de Orpheus, and he was trying in a way to catch on to this bossa nova wave that was taking over the airwaves. But the DJs really were more attracted to side 2 of the record, this piece he wrote called Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And this thing became his super hit up until the Peanuts music. And a lot of times artists don't want to play the same song over and over, but he kept a very good attitude. And in fact, he never minded taking requests to play this music when he appeared live. And when someone asked him what's it like to have to play Cast Your Fate to the Wind over and over, he said, every time I play it, it's like signing the back of a check. He knew that he had lucked out, and it's not just luck, it's skill. He wrote a wonderful piece of music and was very appreciative of that. In fact, the San Francisco Chronicle jazz critic Ralph Gleason once asked him, do you feel like you sold out by writing that song? And Guaraldi said, no, I feel like I bought in. Which is exactly what happened. One historian that studied his career specifically commented that the importance of jazz impressions of a boy named Charlie Brown, this was a piece he wrote, and its successor, the score to the Christmas special, cannot be overstated. Rarely has an entertainment icon been so quickly and firmly welded to a musical composition, indeed to an entire body of work from one individual. Guaraldi defined the Peanuts sound, and it's just as true today as it was in the 1960s. The compositions themselves are uniformly sparkling. It's as if the jazz pianist and his trio were waiting for this precise inspiration. Oh. And that really describes it better than we can. You know, Guaraldi went on to write scores for 13 additional Peanuts television specials, as well as a feature film in 1969 called A Boy Named Charlie Brown. The music sounds great, and I have never met anyone that doesn't like it.
Right, and it's nice to know that he was so good-spirited about it, too. You know, like you say, artists can feel kind of bogged down by their hits, but it sounds like he really treasured his.
And I think it also is music that, because it's jazz in nature and it is going to incorporate improvisation, it can be different every time that it's played. That's the main thing about jazz, right? The soloists or the players have this freedom to improvise. And so maybe it's easier to make the 17th version of Christmas Time Is Here a little more interesting because you can do it a little differently.
No doubt our 2 guests are just wonderful at this particular aspect of jazz.
Oh, I can't wait to hear what they're going to do.
Last of all, we should probably touch at least a bit on Johann Strauss. We're doing the Pizzicato Polka, which is a very fun piece.
Yes, Johann Strauss was wildly popular in the 1800s, along with his father, who was also a composer. They had this sort of musical dynasty going. His father employed 200 musicians and would sometimes perform or conduct at 6 separate balls per night. He would be taken by carriage from one place to the next. They played mostly waltzes, but there were a lot of marches and other types of music as well. His father didn't want Johann Strauss Jr. to be a musician. He wanted him to be a banker. And in fact, he beat him once as a young child when he discovered him secretly practicing the violin. But he was unable to prevent Johann Jr. from a career in music. And he had many, many popular and wonderful compositions just like his father did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the thing about Strauss is you think that it's simple music because sometimes it sounds that way, but in reality, it's not. It's hard to play and make it sound exactly right, in part because it is so sparse. It's sparsely put together. Sometimes there's not a whole lot going on in terms of all the instruments being played and counterpoint and everything else. But the timeless melodies in his music are what give it that sort of shimmering, attractive quality that people come back to again and again.
Mm-hmm. What's so delightful about the Pizzicato Polka is, of course, that it is fully played pizzicato, which, for the uninitiated, is when a bowed instrument is plucked instead.
That's exactly right. They hold their bow in their hand or set it down and just pluck the strings with their finger.
Mm-hmm.
And this is always surprising to me how they are able to keep that together. The rhythmic accuracy in a piece like this or other passages where they play using the pizzicato technique, it always hangs together better than those of us in the back row think that it's going to. Well, I asked a friend of mine, a violinist, about it. You know, why is it not hard? Why does it not sound harder to do this? And he explained that, well, now when you're playing pizzicato, your finger is right on the string as opposed to having this bow, which makes you able to play much more accurately, which makes sense, but I hadn't really thought of it that way before.
Yeah, I can just imagine it going wrong, just plunk, 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 plunk all over the room.
Right. And
you have to be just right on it with everybody.
It's funny you should say plunk, 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 because Leroy Anderson wrote a pizzicato piece called Jazz Pizzicato in 1938, and he wrote another one in 1958 that he simply titled Plink, Plank, Plunk. Maybe next year we'll play that on the holiday concert.
Wonderful. Thanks for tuning in early. Enjoy the show.